Thank you all for staying this late in the evening after what's been a splendid day of conversation and presentations. There were people who were understandably distressed that they had only 10 minutes to talk, and I felt deeply guilty. I should probably have been in that 10-minute slot. You would have enjoyed many of those presentations far more. But thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here and to share with you, much as the others were doing, work that I have begun recently on which I'd love to have responses and thoughts and suggestions. And you don't need the gray hair. You can make the suggestions nonetheless. I want to first say a little, just a couple of things about the title that I chose to send in. Can you hear me? You want this nearer me? Okay. Is that better? All right. Unarchived Histories is an important title for us, for all of us who've been thinking about the politics of history writing, what makes something history, what makes something an archive. And I want to say 2 or 3 things about that phrase, unarchived histories, the way in which I use it now. As Sarah said, we've been, since I moved to Emory now 10 years ago, I've tried to build a conversation between scholars of the US and scholars of India, scholars of the global north and scholars of the global south, to think about their different ways of writing history, their different apprehensions of the politics of history. And in that series of conversations and meetings that we had, perhaps the last couple were on the theme of unarchived histories, to which I gave the subtitle, The Mad and the Trifling. And I want to speak to all of that. The first thing I want to say is that unarchived here does not refer to histories that do not have an archive. Unarchived refers to histories that have been unarchived, that have been actively delegitimized, pushed out of the realm of knowledge, of history, of that we need to attend to. And as my colleague Ruby Lal said to you earlier today, and as we have been saying for some time, the archive is not already given. It's not a bundle of documents lying in a shelf or in a building. The archive is something that our questions produce. Very often, the very same archive actually produces different histories because we take different questions to it. So unarchived is here an active verb. It is the suggestion that histories, the very process of writing history, if you like, unarchives many histories. There are certain things that qualify as history. There are others that are delegitimized, disenfranchised, thrown out of, denied the status of history. I want to suggest, secondly, that we think a little bit more broadly, capaciously, and differently, provocatively, about the notion of the archive. Not a repository of traces of the past, but a domain of knowledge that is accepted as knowledge. Foucault puts this well. The archive is the sayable. It is that can be said, that for which there is a frame, there is a recognition that this is legitimate knowledge. Okay? And this is very important in the sense that there are all kinds of things, and I'm going to try and demonstrate this to you, or at least illustrate this for you in the course of what I say. There are all kinds of things that we know about and think about and read about, which do not qualify, even in the minds of those writing them or presenting them, as significant knowledge. They are presented as trifling things, trivial things. And we want to say something about that. So the archive is the sayable, the comprehensible, the reasonable, that is reasoned, not the mad, not the realm of unreason. Foucault had that particular proposition to make about the archive, about the realm of knowledge. There was the realm of unreason, paradigmatically, the mad, the people who were put on ships of fools, and people who spoke nonsense, gibberish. That was not knowledge. That was not sayable. It was not a language that you could understand or needed to attend to. So our sense of what should count as archives must take into account that the archive is a political act. It is the construction of a body of material as reasonable, as within a language of reason, as something we need to attend to because it makes sense. I mentioned to you that Foucault produces as a boundary for that the unreasonable, if you like, the gibberish, the nonsense, the realm of the mad. I've suggested, and we did it in these conversations, I suggested another category which is of some importance. A category of the trifling. Something that is so common, so obvious, so everyday, so repetitive, that we don't need to pay attention to it. It doesn't count as knowledge. It doesn't count as history. It's not something that you investigate or work through, or that you can investigate. And it's naturalized very often. The most sharp examples of that would obviously be labor, daily labor, women's labor, reproductive labor, stuff that is so naturalized that it cannot have a history. And it took a very long time before the domestic world became part of that needed to be apprehended as historical. Okay? So I'm pointing to the trifling because this is going to be of some importance in the work that I'm doing today. I'm going to present to you today. But before that, I want to give you two examples of the kinds of things that were not part of our history. They were not part of our history because they were not sayable, or because they were there was no frame for them, because that's how it is, right? Those sorts of things. So the first example I give you will come out of my work on partition, where I made the point, and this is now some time ago, this is common sense, it's almost not worth saying it, but I made the point that it was very interesting that we wrote histories of partition in which violence was outside partition. Partition produced the violence. The violence was not really our history. Our history was partition. Somehow, these two things were disaggregated. They were separated. And violence was something that others did to us, that the British did, that Jinnah Sahib did, or Patel did, or somebody else did. The violence was, it was just not in our blood. We, spiritual, non-violent, Hindus, Buddhists, what have you, right? And so the point that that particular book made, and a point I believe of some importance, was that the partition was the violence. And to write a history of partition as a history of something that produced violence just disregards the archive. Produces a different kind of official archive. That's of importance because, of course, all nationalist historiography on all sides produces precisely that kind of argument. We weren't responsible, this was not our history, violence is something that happened by chance. Whereas if violence is partition, if the mark of that particular thing, which we have named partition, we could have named it, and we probably should have named it genocide, civil war, all kinds of other things that would have brought home to us the enormity, the awfulness of this particular event that we visited on ourselves. We would have been implicated in that history in a way in which our inherited historiographies did not allow us to think of ourselves. Right? I want to give you a very different example from the work I've done on Dalits and African Americans in the book called The History of Prejudice, published a few years ago, of a wonderful Dalit woman writer called Baby Kamble, who writes an autobiography called Zina Amsa, Our Lives, translated into English very beautifully by a colleague of ours from Hyderabad, Maya Pandit, and the English translation is called The Prisons We Broke, I mention it because you may wish to read it. And The Prisons We Broke, like Jina Amsa, is a remarkable, remarkable, beautiful, powerful account, memoir, of the anti-caste struggle in southwest Maharashtra, of the villages where this Mahar community lived, and this generation of people who grew up in the shadow of Ambedkar, hearing about Ambedkar, and learnt through and from Ambedkar about the possibilities of a different world, of the kind of world they needed to make. And Baby Kamble writes a very moving, very powerful account of herself, her husband, that generation of little girls and boys and students growing up in that sort of world to resist the caste inheritance, the caste-dominated society, the hierarchical values, all of that, of the society they'd grown up in. Yet, what runs right through Baby Kamble's account, right through, is an account of how awfully little girls were treated as daughters-in-law, how awfully girls and women were treated by the men in the families, all the families, her own mother, herself, the littlest transgression, the littlest suspicion of something that women might have done by walking out of the home, by staying too long at school, by talking to somebody in the village, right? The littlest transgression could lead to very serious punishment. So her mother is beaten up by her father, she is beaten up by her husband, this sort of thing. She reports it at great length. She writes about this at great length right through the book. And yet, the book is about our struggle against the upper castes. The entire book. And when her translator, Maya Pandit, said to her, "But you write about all of this. Why didn't you name it? Why doesn't this become the subject of your memoir?" She says, "But how could I? That was my community. My community is not something I write a history of. It's natural. Husbands always did this. They treated women like footwear." She says that in so many words. And so what you've got is particular frames, inherited political struggles, the movement, which allows you to write particular kinds of histories. Outside that frame, outside inherited questions, it is difficult to ask a different kind of question. It is difficult to make this a more complicated history of anti-caste struggle, which is also anti-patriarchal struggle in a very significant way. And it is in that sort of context that I've moved on. Having worked on peasants and having worked on minority communities in India and worked on Dalits, it struck me and it seemed important to me to ask the question, why is it that we do not write a history of men in the home? Of men in the home through the period of anti-colonial struggle. We raise these questions in some sort of abstract way, but there isn't a very detailed, interested, engaged, angry account of what happens here. What is it that produces that lack, right? And the answers at the broadest level are very easy, it seems to me. There is the naturalness of family, home, motherhood that delegitimizes this domain from the domain of the historical. It is not something you write a history about. It's a denial of history. Our homes, our families, our mothers have always been sacred. We do not write about this. But there was more to it than that. There was the fact of an anti-colonial struggle of great importance, an anti-colonial struggle in which the family, the mother, the home became sacred, particularly sacred. It was very important to mark the space off from what colonialism could interfere with, could pollute, could seek to transform in any way. And so what we end up with is a fairly unhistorical account, a historical account with no history of the home and the family and the mother. And I want to just set this in the light of my conversations with scholars of the US and scholars of India. I want to just set this by the side of something that a great fiction writer and essayist, on the United States, says about the American family and the mid-20th century American family, which is a good parallel for me. So this is Barbara Kingsolver. Many of you will have read, and if you've not read Barbara Kingsolver, please read her, who says that in the mid-20th century, in a span of 2 decades, I need to start that again. Okay, in the mid-20th century, in a span of 2 decades, housework was elevated from humble necessity to career status. From humble necessity to career status. She makes the point that working class people, women, had always worked. The middle class woman is the question mark here. And the life of the middle class women in nuclear family homes in an expanding suburbia became the norm and ideal for America. Okay? The media described the home and its care as a woman's appointed place, her calling, her God-given duty, what one might even call her career, though they would not have called it her career. Yes? And as Kingsolver says, what those glossy magazines and the media and other repeated accounts of the American way, the American spirit, the American home, the American dream, what they were invoking as the natural order of things was, and I'm quoting her, an artifice of a post-war economy, a kind of household that was practicable for just about 20 years, not 2000. Okay? Now that's very important. Some economic, political, cultural conjuncture produces the ideal, the kind of home that we should have. And I want to suggest that something of the same order happens in India in the late 19th centuries through to the mid-20th century. And it's been one that's been hard to combat for a number of reasons. One is what my colleague Partha Chatterjee describes as the split in the in the anti-colonial struggle between the inner and the outer. The need to preserve the inner as that will be uncontaminated, whatever you may do. Okay, that's a very large part of it. There's another part to it, which is in this era of anti-colonial struggle, the importance of public service, of work out there, of dedication to transforming the world, in which the men particularly must take part. Women too must be educated, and women too may participate in this, but women must preserve that inner space, that sanctity of the home and of the woman's duty, whatever it may be. Men must perform this public service, and it is primary. It overrides almost any other duty that they may ever have had. And so it's in that context that we come up with a particular rendering of family and home, and of men's place in the home, and of an argument about why men's place in the home is what it is, which is not in the home much of the time. Okay. The examples I'm going to give you, or the work that I began here, relies very heavily on writing in Hindi, on memoirs and autobiographies, some of them very lengthy ones. Rahul Sankrityayan, who's one of the authors and thinkers and activists that I write about, think about, has a 6-volume autobiography running into thousands of pages. Very detailed diary account of everything that he did over his long career. And this is part of the reason why I decided to do this work in Hindi. I have not, given our colonial heritage, I have not done academic work in the past, not produced a long academic essay in Hindi ever before. I've done journalistic pieces, many, many of them. But I decided that here was material that the Hindi scholars in India knew extremely well, and material that they had worked with and used for decades now, which I was beginning to use, perhaps with somewhat different questions. I wanted to do it in the language they did it in forums where they wrote and they spoke, so that we could have a conversation that might arouse provoke this response, if no other. Gyan, you don't understand what you're talking about. You really don't know this stuff. You know, it's more complicated than that, whatever it may be. We could have a conversation of a very different kind than the kinds we have when they read stuff that I've written in English and I read stuff that they've written in Hindi, and we pass each other in various seminars and address one question to each other. So for that reason, I began writing this in Hindi, and it's been an extraordinarily important and learning experience for me. I have really, I've learned at every step here. I'm going to give you the example of 3 men, though I will devote my time in the main. And I'm not sure who's in the chair. Sarah, you're in the chair? Please tell me 10 minutes before you want me to stop, because coming from Delhi, I talk on endlessly. Okay, so 10 minutes more, if you wouldn't mind. Yeah, and I can stop almost at any point in this thing. But here's the general frame of what happens through the lives and careers of these 3 different people. Rajendra Prasad, the first President of India, first Chairman of the Constituent Assembly, and so on and so forth. Premchand, the great Hindi-Urdu novelist of the late 19th and more so the early 20th, mid-20th centuries. And Rahul Sankrityayan, a great scholar, writer, and activist who at different stages of his life was a Buddhist monk. He became Buddhist sannyasi, wanderer, great scholar who knew 7 different languages, wrote in 7 different languages, knew more than that, and wrote 10,000 pages in his life. You know, it's that kind of thing. And an indefatigable campaigner for Hindi to be adopted as the national language of India. And he sketches in his work a whole philosophy of what the place of man and of the ideal man, of the man who would be a model, the model of man for modern India would be. And that ideal I'll come to. He provides, it seems to me, a paradigm case of the issues at stake here. He provides them in the form of rebellion, of commentary on his home life. He's married 3 times, or has 3 different relationships which are like marriage. The first is when he's the age of 11. He's married off as a child, as many people, many men and women were, and he abandons that wife 10 years later, sometime. But he abandons her, saying that this is an insult to us. This is an insult to me. The society is to blame for what is happening here. I am not responsible for this marriage. He leaves. He wanders as a scholar, as a great researcher into ancient Tibetan, Buddhist, Sanskrit texts, looking to recover the great languages and resources of Central Asia and South Asia. He wanders in Russia. He ends up in Leningrad, teaching for a little while, 2 months in 1939, and he marries or gets together with somebody working at the Oriental Institute in Leningrad and has a son. They have a son together. And this is when he's 45. He stays there for 2 months for various reasons having to do with visas, having to do with not being able to do his work, political and literary. He leaves at the end of 2 months. And a second abandonment. He comes back to India and he never meets that wife. No, he meets that wife and son once more for a period of 2 years, which he finds really almost unmanageable when he goes back to Leningrad, and he finds this sojourn, this period with them, an impossible interference with his real work of political and literary service to India. But on returning to India in 1947, after that 2-year period with his wife and son in Leningrad, in 1947, just after Indian independence, within a few months, he marries again, a much younger woman, actually a Nepali, and probably a very lower caste, poor family woman, who now becomes his nurse, his typist, his various things. And I write in this particular thing that this pattern of 3 marriages, of a child marriage, of a love match somewhere along the line, and of a marriage which an older person needs to be looked after almost. A marriage where you're being nursed in your older age, where you're being looked after and supported in your old age, seems to recur in many, many of these examples. Even when there is only one marriage. You do not have to marry 3 times to have that pattern. The pattern can happen with just one marriage. It can happen with more than one. And so we get, it seems to me, an interesting statement about, and I'll come to Rahul Sankrityan's statement. He has a philosophy on what marriage should be and the home should be. But I want to just give you an example of the 3 kinds of marriages with Premchand. Premchand, who married at the age of 15, he was forced into a marriage, but a marriage he was quite excited about, who stayed with his first wife for 10 years, but then left her because it was too difficult. She was not what he'd anticipated. There was too much fighting at home. There was interruption with his work. He used to leave her at home in the village near Banaras. He used to travel and go off to the places where he was appointed a teacher. And ultimately, again, 10 years or so into their marriage, he leaves her forever. And within 1 year of that, he marries again. Pressed to some extent by his mother-in-law, who wants a daughter-in-law, wants somebody in the house, but pressed, it seems to me too, by his own desire to be married and to have the ideal marriage, so he marries a child widow, a woman who had been married when she was a child and had been widowed within a few months. And so Shivrani Devi becomes his second wife, and she leaves a fascinating, fascinating memoir of their life together. A memoir called, and it's called Premchand Ghar Mein, Premchand in the Home. And it's an extraordinary memoir because it's a very detailed account of an unusual, fulfilling, rich relationship of a marriage that would, on the face of it, seem to be a very successful marriage in every sense of the term. Except that she was very much younger, and he was guiding her, he was coaching her, he was wanting her to do things. He wanted her to be this educated, modern woman. But he also wanted her to be the Indian woman. He wanted her very much to live up to all the ideals and the greatness of the mother who is almost a holy figure, and the mother whom he, as he said to her at one point in his life, the mother's love that he never had because his own mother died when he was very little. So then he had this mother-in-law, and that was just not the kind of relationship he wanted. And Shivrani Devi, in a fascinating way, subscribes to many of those same ideals, same sorts of thoughts. That is the role of woman. That is what a woman should be. A woman should be like a mother. She should be able to, and she should look after the man. She should look after the children. She should look after the home. And the man's job is something somewhat different. I'm going to refer to this in Premchand's terms in a minute. But for her, there's an interesting tension, uncertainty, problem. She begins to write, for example. She writes short stories, as he does. She's inspired by him. And she publishes some of these. And he says to her, when one of her stories is published, and somebody comes to Premchand and says, "Oh, so you wrote this for her," right? Yeah, she could never have written this on her own. And he is upset, he is angry with that critic, but he's also, for some reason, disturbed by her. And he says, "I wish you just hadn't begun to write all these stories and things." At least you shouldn't publish them, because it becomes a headache for me. I have to take all of this on. And so there's this very interesting, fascinating relationship in which he wishes her to be conversant with Urdu, wishes her to learn English, wishes her not to be veiled in front of the elders, wishes her to go everywhere that he goes. But at the same time, to be careful. Don't upset the boat too much. Don't rock the boat too much. They have a very interesting, as I say, this is an unusual, moving sort of relationship. They have a competition about who can do more public service, who can do better literary work, who will go to jail in the freedom struggle. And she manages to go. He never goes. And it's an interesting moment, because she writes about it and he writes about it. He actually refers to this, that she managed to do this. But the interesting thing is that her account of the marriage is an account of a remarkably rich relationship, enriching relationship, one in which they get to know one another, where they become great companions, where they learn to and they grow together, where they want to do things for one another. And it's rewarding in all sorts of ways. He is an extraordinary man in every sense of the term from her point of view. And he is an extraordinary man from the point of view of many, many other people who knew him. He's a modest man. He's a man who really he works very hard at home. He works with the children. He does all sorts of things that many, many Indian men do not do. But he has a very different account of this same relationship, this same period of life together. So where she talks about this extraordinary and unusual togetherness and of growing together, he writes nothing very detailed about his relationship with her. She writes a whole book when he's passed, and it's published soon after. And it's a really very moving account, one that you've got to take, you've got to read between the lines in all sorts of ways, obviously. But he never writes anything about this whole period. He writes towards the end of his life, the year before he died, actually. He writes a letter in English to somebody who is interviewing him, asking him about his life and his career and so on. And in a letter, in these two paragraphs, which I'm going to read to you, he says something about the marriage, which is very striking. My married life, he says, has nothing of romance. She said exactly the opposite. It was a remarkably romantic life. 1933, he went to give a talk in Lucknow University, and the two of them were between intervals, and he was being feted. He was given a medal, he was given an award by the university and so on. And in an intermission, halfway through the proceedings during that day, they wander out and they sit by a canal near the university hostel. And under a tree, he takes off the garland that he's been given and he puts it over her. She writes that he garlands her with that garland and says, "This is our love marriage. We're now married in a new way." Right? So for her, this is what the marriage, what the togetherness was all about. He says, my married life has nothing of romance. It is just the common type. This letter is written in English. I've not had to translate this one. My first wife died in 1904, he says. She was not dead when he's saying this. She's still alive. My first wife died in 1904. She was an unfortunate woman, not at all good looking. And although not satisfied with her, I pulled on uncomplainingly, just as all traditional husbands do. When she died, I married a Bal Vidva, a child widow, and I'm fairly happy with her. She has picked up some literary tastes and sometimes writes stories. She is a fearless, bold, uncompromising, sincere lady, amenable to a fault and awfully impulsive. She joined the non-cooperation movement and went to jail. I am happy with her, not claiming what she cannot give. I just claim what a woman should give. Well, life for me has always been work, work, work. Even when I was in government service, I devoted my whole time to literary pursuits. I find pleasure in work. So those are the two perceptions of a life at home that I think we need to reckon with. And there's something really fascinating and troubling about the possibility of saying, life for me has been work, work, work. Nothing else counts. As opposed to saying, this was a troubled relationship in the beginning. I found it difficult to think of his home. This is Shivrani Devi. Think of his home as my home. It was 8 years into our marriage that I first began to think that way, when he recognized that he needed to protect me a little bit more from my mother-in-law than he ever did. You know, he used to just leave it to me to handle whatever was going on in the home. And she says, I used to spend 1 month in his home and I used to spend 2 months in my parents' home. I used to just go home. And it was 8 years into my marriage that these things began to change. It's a very different sense of what the world is. She gradually comes to see his home as my home. This is our home. We live here. These are our children. We build another life. We build a life for an independent India, for an India that will not be colonized, that is not subject to this slave mentality and so on and so forth. Rahul Sankrityayan, whom I mentioned to you earlier, produces a philosophy of what marriage and home should be. He writes a book called Ghumakkar Shastra, a philosophy of wandering. Ghumakkar Shastra was written in 1949. The philosophy or science of wandering, if you like. Okay? And in it, Rahul advocates an idea of attachment and belonging based on ephemerality. It is something that is ephemeral. Belonging is to many places, many, many ways. An attachment and belonging that is scattered through the several sites of home, as the wanderer wanders from one hearth to another, one location to another, one home to another. Those who choose this higher life, I'm translating from Ghumakkar Shastra. Those who choose this higher life, Sankrityayan says, have to abandon worldly attachment and worries. And I'm quoting now, for a life of wandering, freedom from worry is essential, just as wandering is essential for freedom from worry. The brave young man or woman who embraces the religion of wandering needs to follow his or her own desire, unmindful, he writes, unmindful of a mother's tears, a father's fears and sorrows, the wailing of a wife whom he has unthinkingly married, or the imagination, the prognostications, the fears of an ill-fated husband. So either way, right? The ideal person, even a woman, should be ready to wander, should be ready to. And then he talks about, why am I saying this? And so he goes on to say, wandering is the religion of humanity. Whoever gives it up is unworthy of being called a human being. It is the only way to fulfill one's life and make something of the individual and of society. You have to wander. You have to find many places. In this context, he refers to the Buddha, he refers to Guru Nanak, he refers to Dayanand Saraswati, and other sages, the great wanderers and makers of India, past and present. And he says this is true of the world. You know, think of Jesus, think of the Prophet Muhammad, think of all the people who have made the world. They were wanderers. That is what the ideal human being needs to be. Love for one's nation, birthplace, original home never disappears, he notes. It even grows when one moves far away, as those of us who live in the West know. And the woman who feels betrayed, even leaving one's wife is beneficial, not harmful for this purpose, right? And the woman who feels betrayed by such abandonment should take revenge on the society that chained the couple together, rather than the likely innocent, non-adult individual she is chained to. Right? Now this is absolutely fascinating because, of course, when he was writing this, 1949, he had just got together with this young woman, 37 years younger than him, this Nepali woman, from a poor probably lower caste family. He was dictating this to her about the need for abandonment, the need not to be tied to a woman. And he married her within a month or so of this dictation. So it's an extraordinary kind of blindness that goes through in talking about this Ghumakkar Shastra, this extraordinary dedication to humanity, to human service, to public service, to the making of the new society that people like Rahul or people like Premchand or the Indian men of this time needed to embrace. It needed to be part of them. And the other side of this, in some senses, is provided to us by Rajendra Prasad's. I should mention one other thing. I mentioned Ghumakkar Shastra. In the 2 years that Rahul spent in Leningrad with his wife and son, with the Russian wife and son, he has a chapter in his autobiography, in his memoir of that period, a very short chapter called Noon Tel Lakdi. Noon Tel Lakdi is salt, oil, wood. Means housework. It means domestic work. And he says in that, and again here there is this powerful statement of the imagined ideal of the times. He says the difference between the gods and human beings is that the gods have never had to worry about noon tel lakdi, right? देवता और देवियों को इस काम में कभी कुछ दखल नहीं देनी पड़ी, हमको देनी पड़ती है. That's our problem, that we have to pay attention to housework. And so in the cold of the Leningrad winter, he refused to chop wood. His wife had to do it for him. He was afraid of cutting himself because he was so incapable, coming from Eastern UP and from the kind of zamindari background that he did. But he also, astonishing things about the kind of work that a person is willing to do. He agreed to do the dishwashing because he had to do something at the home, and the woman was a bit stronger than perhaps he was used to. And she used to heat water for him to wash the dishes. He refused to use the heated water. He used to run the tap because he thought it was quicker, even though the water coming out of the tap was so cold that it almost froze his hands. And so he just didn't want to waste any time. He didn't have the time to wash the dishes with hot water. It was going to take too long. So you have that whole side of things, and you have in Rajendra Prasad a statement about the kind of woman then, the kind of homemaker, the kind of person we need to make our homes what they should be. And Rajendra Prasad says this beautifully in a comment. Beautifully is not the right word. But, what is it? In a very disturbing way, in a comment upon Ba, Mahatma Gandhi's wife, whom he first met in 1917 in the course of the Champaran Satyagraha. And Rajendra Prasad says, I first met her when she came to Champaran to help us, Gandhi and his colleagues, in collecting evidence from the peasants and so on and so forth. On her arrival, Gandhi dismissed the Brahman cook who had been cooking for this team of 13, 15, 17 people, and said, she is now going to look after the kitchen. And they were younger people. They were a little bit disturbed. They said, this is not appropriate. This young woman, this slight woman, why should she be cooking for 14 or 15 of us? And when they expressed this discomfort, Gandhi said to them, he reassured them. She was used to such work, he said, and was more than capable of looking after all of them. The love with which Ba fed and took care of them, Rajendra Prasad writes in his autobiography, was something I have never forgotten. We continue to receive, I'm quoting now, we continue to receive a mother's love from her as long as she lived. She was the very ideal of a Hindu woman, a symbol of Indian culture, and a bundle of love. She was truly Ba. Ba in Gujarati means mother. She was truly Ba, and Ba she remained for all of us. So Shivrani Devi, Ba, all of these people have to become that loving mother who looks after the son, looks after the husband, looks after the elder, the male. And there's remarkable commentary on this by really very, very distinguished and perceptive writers. Firaq Gorakhpuri, some of you will know him, the great Urdu poet, had a very moving and important comment to make on Premchand's women. Premchand writes, as you all know, a huge amount on the women's question, on widows, on child marriage. He has these novels and short stories which are enormously powerful and enormously educative in terms of telling us about the society of the times, India of the first half of the 20th century. These are great, powerful ethnographic accounts. And Firaq Gorakhpuri, who was a younger admirer of Premchand, a great admirer, he really thought the world of Premchand's writings, both in Urdu and in Hindi. Firaq Sahib said about Premchand that a woman, I'm quoting, a woman could be everything for Premchand: sister, daughter, mother, neighbor, fellow worker, life companion, the ruler of the home, goddess. I've translated this from the Hindi. Okay. And many such female characters appear in his writing, all of those things. But the woman who cast an irresistible spell because of her sensuality was beyond his imagination. She never appeared in any of his work. That sensuous woman, the woman who actually just by that casts a spell, is not. Premchand himself described his ideal of woman as follows. Sacrifice, I'm quoting from that same letter in English, sacrifice, service, purity, all rolled into one. Sacrifice without end, service always ungrudging, and purity to that of Caesar's wife beyond reproach. So this becomes the ideal of the Indian home, the Indian, and the place that a woman needs to occupy in it, and a man may not occupy in it. The man who has to do that life, who has to adopt that life of wandering and perform that public service, which is essential to the times. Rahul Sankrityayan comments at one point in the penultimate volume of his autobiography that there was a fundamental difference, indeed opposition. And I think the word is appropriate because when you translate, you're not quite sure which one to use, between his outlook, and he uses the word character, but there was a fundamental difference between his outlook and Kamala's, that of his young wife, the third woman he married. Whereas I am, I'm quoting again, whereas I am ready to follow reason or the intellect blindly, Kamala describes that as escapism. I am astonished at her response, she at mine. What that means, I suggest, is that men believed they had the liberty to choose, to set priorities, and follow their whims, almost without constraint. Women knew this was pharisaical. Because the religion of non-attachment, of wandering and public service that is preached by Rahul Sankrityayan, and in a modified way by Premchand and by Rajendra Prasad. See, it's very important to remember, Rajendra Prasad was at home in the 45 years of his marriage with his wife for maybe 40 months. He was barely at home. He was always out. And he used to go home each time he was too tired, each time he was ill, each time he needed to be looked after. And Premchand's description of his home life, there was no romance in it, comes out in the same sort of way. My life is all work, work, work. Right? That's what my life has been. That's what it needed to be. So this religion of wandering, this religion of public service, was always going to be up against the inescapability of noon tel lakdi, of housework, of looking after children, of attachment, right? That was something that their wives had to accept, like it or not. So Kamla, who becomes the mother of 2 children in 1953 and 1955, 3 years after she marries Rahul Sankrityan, has to look after those children, whatever happens the rest of her life. And she has to put those things together, to hold those things together in her. You're trying to wave, are you? We're getting there. Okay. The philosophy of non-attachment and wandering had to contend with the inescapability of cooking, housework, and the care and upbringing of children. Not to mention the care of people and things that went to make up the community. And this is quite important. For Kamla, as for Shivrani Devi, this home was much larger than the nuclear home we are used to, or we think about. This home included almost always an extensive body of passers-by, of people coming and going, of kinsfolk, of guests, of servants, of townspeople, of village people. And it included the physical trappings of home, the surroundings, the upkeep of a place, which is our home. I need hardly say that many of the arrangements and the rhetorical moves that Rahul Sankrityan makes, or Premchand makes, or Rajendra Prasad in some ways makes, they are hardly exclusive to 20th century India. They'll be found far and wide. But they acquire a particular potency and a particular Indianness, if you like, a distinctness in the course of the anti-colonial struggle in India by the because of the need, if you like, to uphold and promote the anti-colonial struggle, to produce a domain that was sacred, and preserved. And what you got then was this divide between the sacred domain and the domain of public service. The domain of public service that women could enter and should enter. Modern educated women should be part of it. But as women, as the loving mother, as the supporting sister, as the person who was there to carry this public service, carry this public struggle forward in the best, in the most effective manner at this particular time. And so, in addition to predictable arguments about the sanctity of private life and intimacy and progeny and the care of the young and the old, what you get is the exaggerated figure of the elevated status of women, mother as goddess, wife as goddess, on the one hand, and the exaggerated figure of the public service that men must perform, which a Premchand or Rajendra Prasad or Rahul Sankrityan actually dedicated their lives to a large extent. But all sorts of other men use as an argument for being out, for needing to do this other public work, which is our inheritance, our need for a different kind of home, not the kind of home they have there, a home in which our women remain sacred and our space remains sacred. Our public work will be done outside in a different way. I'll stop there. Thank you.
I think all of Bankim-Chandra's works, and there were hundreds, and especially if I mention Nostoni, which was later made into Charulata by Satyajit Ray, I think this concept of the traditional woman and the new modern woman. So I had a particular course where we always engaged in this debate, whether I again remember that question today, and that's why I want to ask that to you. So do you think that, and when you talked about Premchand and you say that this difference in sort of looking at the relationship and sort of how the woman sees it and how he sort of talks about it later. So do you think that this tension between the Prachina and the Nobina, somewhere, the men were trying to struggle with it, and in order to conform to certain existing ideals that were already there, the men were trying to, even if they were accepting certain things internally, they wanted the women to sort of become the modern Indian woman? Was there a tension? Was there a problem that was stopping them from accepting it on the public domain? And maybe that could have led him to write the letter in a completely different way, because he knew people would be reading it. He knew people would know Premchand is saying this. And when I take this example, but I also talk about this in the context of Bengal as well, because when I talk about Charulata, the film, or Noshtonal story anyway, just the end being different, it's, the rest of it is same. So I think even there, the character, the male character, sort of, it somewhere hurts his ego. So when, or in Goda, when Sucharita's character sort of becomes very clear. So is there a problem in sort of, do you think there was a problem in accepting, because society would sort of call you names, or I don't know if I'm constructing it in a proper way, but I hope you get what I want to say.
Sure.
I guess my question is actually related, which is, but I'll frame it a slightly different way, which is I'm just fascinated by the lie and how prominent it is. I mean, so we have this lie, this self-narration that's false. And what I don't know, what do we do with that as a project in the autobiographical? I don't know.
There's a question in the back.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. My question is that the men you talked about, like Premchand and Rahul, Sangita, and these people, or I mean these men who wanted to live a very Bohemian life, or advocated a very Bohemian life in terms of like Gumakkar Shastra and the things they wrote, and they sort of fulfill, and they had this desire to fulfill this fetishization of their public service or the work. Like they wanted to live a Bohemian life, as well as they wanted to fulfill the fetishization of the public service they had, which they called work, that my life is full of work. They constructed a very misogynistic ideal Indian woman, right, in their work, and which they advocated. So this ideal Indian woman comes at the cost of this public service, right? And the concept of the ideal Indian woman comes basically at the cost of slavery of women. Or maybe what I want to say is that this cost of public service is the slavery of the women, which is then eulogized by romanticizing the notions of the ideal Indian women. So I'm thinking about these contradictions, like how these men were advocating a certain kind of eulogization of ideal Indian women, which was actually a slavery, and how this slavery was sort of was like fulfilling or complicit in fulfilling their desire for this fetishization they had for the public service.
Let you answer.
Thank you very much for your talk. I very much enjoyed it. My question, I suppose, is, I don't want to put it in terms of being more empirical, but it is to some degree. I'm actually very interested in the life history of Rahulji and of his wife in particular, because I wonder if you feel that this kind of teaching or ideal of wandering and non-attachment, if that came to impact her life in any such way, because
which wife have we? Kamla?
Yeah, because she went on to have quite a prolific life as a professor. She received a PhD. She was a prolific how that is reconciled with this larger picture of woman being simply a kind of domestic individual, of preserving the sanctity of the tradition.
My turn? Okay. That's a set of interesting questions. I'm not sure how to answer that first one about the Prachin and the Navina, except to say this, that I think the Prachin is constructed at this time. And it's important for us to mark that the ideal ancient Indian woman is actually produced at this time. Right? It's critical for us to mark that. The traditions are produced. Right? The new is there, and there's tension about that new, because you've produced the ideal as this person who upholds everything that we have always been, an ancient civilization, a sacred set of relationships which we have treasured, we have valued. Yeah? Once you produce that, there's a certain tension about what kind of liberties, openness is going to be given to women to question that in any way, right? And the danger for all of these reformers was precisely that women, once they had schooling, once they had the magazines, once they had the ability to write, like Shivrani Devi writing a story, might actually open up areas which are uncomfortable for the men. And this happens repeatedly. It just happens all over the place. How much of it one's going to say is, consciously thought out, what it is? That's a difficult one. See, the resources available to Indian men and women to fight the colonial denigration of their society included the sense of an ancient civilization, a great ancient civilization, which we will preserve. So they fight to preserve it. They also had to fight against the colonial denigration of the place of woman. And so it becomes marked amongst reformers, amongst nationalists, neo-nationalists, Gandhi, Nehru, you name them. It becomes marked as that particular site, which is especially elevated, especially sacred, especially unusual in our heritage. Our women are like goddesses, right? So how much of this is by design, is worked out as, we won't let our women do this. That would be a hard one to say, and it's a psychological inquiry which you almost don't need. What we do need to say is that we construct an image and a picture of a society that has been like this, in which our women do not do those things, right? You construct that sort of society as your way of fending off what are very strong attacks by a colonial society, saying the status of your women shows to us how uncivilized and barbaric you are. The lie in Premchand's way is fascinating, and it's a lie that's repeated by Rahul Sankrityan. Okay. The lie is an odd thing because in both cases, in the case of Kamala Sankrityan as well as in the case of Shivrani Devi, they find out long after their marriages that the first wife is still alive. In Rahul's case, there are two wives still alive. And they find out from third parties usually. Shivrani Devi overhears a conversation between the brother, perhaps, or cousin of Premchand's first wife, who's come from her village, her native village, to talk to him and to say something about financial support, whatever it may be. She overhears this, and she confronts him with it. Shivrani Devi says to Premchand, "Why did you lie to me? Why is it that you all pretended that your first wife had died?" And he has the most astonishing response to that. He says that "Jo mar gaya, jo dimag mein mar gaya, wo mar gaya. Jo zinda hai, wo zinda hai. वो मेरे दिमाग में है ही नहीं. She's gone. And so it's kind of self-serving in very peculiar ways. But it is a much more complicated story than that. That lie happens. Shivrani Devi discovers now that the older wife still lives in the village and says to Premchand, you must bring her home. Bring her here. I will look after her. He resists. Luckily, I suspect, luckily in the end for them, the first wife says, I will not come unless Premchand comes to get me. And he says, I will not go. She wants him to go. So it's extraordinarily layered, contradictory in all sorts of ways. Shivrani Devi buys much of the argument about that ideal Indian woman. She is living that life too, even as she's challenging it. That is the story that we have to tell. In Rahul's case, Kamala Sankrityayan finds out, I forgot now the number of years, but something like 7 years after they had met and got together and married, that his wife and son were in Russia, that they still lived there. And she tells this to the Russian wife and son when they finally meet in a Moscow hospital in Rahul's last days. I'll come back to it. You had a question about that. I'll come back to that in a minute. The Bohemian Life, I just want to say, I think we need to mark the very contradictory, self-contradictory character of these narratives and this history. I do not think we can make very quick, dismissive statements about these people, or say, they're Bohemian characters justifying themselves, getting away with whatever they wanted to do, and producing, you use the words, the slavery of women to justify what they're doing. I want to say to you that Rajendra Prasad was anything but Bohemian. Rajendra Prasad was a deeply devoted Gandhian worker. And, he spent his entire life, literally spent his entire life, going from ashram to ashram, doing social service. But what he does, and we just have to take this on, what he does is dedicate himself. He gets married to the national movement, to the Gandhian way of life, to the Gandhian struggle, not to his home, not to his wife and his son, who are left at home. Now, Bohemian, the slavery of the wife, I don't know. This is, again, I suspect that the wife shared it with him, shares many of these thoughts with him. So I would hesitate to say either about Rajendra Prasad or about Premchand that these were Bohemians. Premchand, as I said to you, Premchand has an extraordinary reputation amongst all the people who knew him, that he was a really wonderful man in the home and outside the home, that he was a very lovable, affable, supportive homemaker, that he did everything for his wife and for his children. If the wife was ill, he looked after her. When the children needed to be dressed and taken to school, he did all of that. So it's not a very quick kind of misogynistic move. I hate women and they can now look after the children. I'm going to go and do my own thing, whatever it is. There's something more going on here. It is more layered. It is more contradictory. It is one where I think the ideal of public service comes to have a status that we have not acknowledged adequately. And it is a status that is very widely shared, very, very widely shared. I grew up with parents and with elders who kept talking about this. This is what our lives needed to be. They needed to be lives of public service, right? But for those lives of public service, which in the end tended to be men's lives of public service, you needed the woman at home. You needed the woman to look after the home in this exceptional way, in this devoted way. Like Ba, you needed the woman as mother, looking after everybody. So I'm not quite sure how I would modify some of what you're saying. I don't think it's the slavery of women that's being called for. I don't think it's for a Bohemian life. But I think there are some very unusual, distinct moments here in this construction of the appropriate place of men and women in the home and outside. Okay? That's what's going on through this period. And the thing about Rahul and Kamala is fascinating. it's very interesting that Rahul was very keen that Kamala gets her master's degree, gets a PhD, finds a job, so that her future and the future of his children with her is secure. He was very, very deeply concerned about this. He spent his last years agitating, anguished about this. There's no question of that. But he would not let her go from where he was. She got a job in other cities. She was offered jobs in many places. He couldn't let her go because she had to look after him. She had to give him his insulin injections. And so it's a very peculiar thing. Her life of wandering, if you want to call it that, is not a life of wandering. She's still, very much rooted in various places. But her life as a scholar, as a translator, as somebody who comes to be recognized as a significant public intellectual, all happens after he's died. And for a very long time, she had no job. It was a very troubling relationship. And the last volume of his autobiography is fascinating because she writes it. She puts it together. And it's completely different from the earlier volumes of the autobiography. And it's an anguished volume because she wants to show her love and respect and great admiration for this man. And yet, this pain, the difficulty of living up to all the things that he insisted upon comes through all of the time. It just comes through repeatedly.
We have a few more questions.
Thanks for that wonderful talk. You make beautiful use of memoirs to unarchive aspects of the past, as you put it. And this talk also reminded me of the talk you gave.
Kind of modeled over and over and over again. But I also do think that there are inflections which are really unusual in different places. And the inflections in India attend to public service in this particular way, for example, in the 20th century. You don't get that in many, many places. They attend to the sacred status of the mother, the extraordinary, and to the fact that woman is primarily mother, almost from the time when she's a little girl. She's being trained to be a mother. Okay? And so those inflections are important for us to mark. They are a product of this time, it seems to me. I think there are parallels otherwise. I mean, clearly, the woman's place in the home, the man's place is to do public work, bring in the income, look after the family, reproduce the line, if you like, and so on and so forth. Those are found worldwide, if you like. But I do think the particular rhetoric that surrounds these things, the particular legitimizing principles, languages that are found and brought to bear, they vary. And it's important for us to pay attention to them. The question about the memoirs and whether caste plays a thing into the kinds of argument that Shivrani Devi or Kamala Sankrityayan are able to, the kind of critique they're able to present, and Baby Kamla is not. I'm hesitant to say that it comes straight from a caste thing. Kamala Sankrityayan, as far as I know, is a Dalit woman. Okay, so that already puts the argument about the critique that is possible to upper caste people into a different perspective. It's open to other people. Baby Kamle's is not a non-critical statement about the life at home. It's very critical. It is so fundamentally critical about the way in which the men lived that Maya Pandit is able to say to her, well, why didn't you foreground this? Why don't you make it, as it were, the frame of what you're writing? Why is the frame only the Ambedkarite struggle? Why is it not this frame as well? And to that she responds. And I think that's a statement about the time. That was the time of the Ambedkarite struggle. It is the time of an unprecedented and remarkable awakening, especially among the Mahars. And at that time, she says, my community, I had to write what my community was suffering. I had to write what my community was feeling. And her community at that time is not the community of women, which at some other time it could easily be. And Dalit women certainly have produced that kind of argument subsequently. There's a very major Dalit women's movement which raises these kinds of questions in significant ways. You want to say something? Say it. Go on.
I do want to say something.
Yeah?
So why is this, so this is a kind of provocative statement, but so why is this, the Dalit memoirs that you were looking at, and the Dalit representations of mid-century life, or Dalit representations of century life, but these are not, this is not upper caste men at home, it's men at home. So I'm asking about the households, you know, and all these men were upper caste, right? Even if
These three were.
right? And the woman might not have been, but so caste, that privilege and that status is there in the household.
Yeah. Except that part of my 20,000 words in Hindi also makes the point that that Dalit households can be described in the same way and have been described in the same way. That is, you know, I think that the material is available. Obviously, working class people have a different you know, set of circumstances to deal with. Obviously, the women work in a way that upper caste women and, you know, zamindari family women don't. So there are differences, and yet many of these structures are reproduced, and many of the same arguments are reproduced in quite interesting ways. So I make the suggestion that it applies to Muslim households, it applies to lower caste households, and to upper caste households too. But it does seem to me important to mark that critiques are made. The frames are not always available within which those critiques will be seen as critiques of patriarchy, for example. Right? Those frames appear at certain times in our history and in the context of particular political struggles. So if I heard you right, that would be my response. The question of trying to get to the truth of history, see, it seems to me that what has happened in the world of historical, anthropological, social science scholarship over the last 30 or 40 years is to question, to problematize, at least, this notion of the truth with a capital T. So we're not trying to get to the truth of history. This is what really happened. What we all are trying to do, it seems to me, and it's important for us to do so, is to ask the question, whose truth is this? Who produced this kind of argument? Who produces this narrative? Where does it come from? And these are very important ways of understanding our history, because those narratives are our history. That's what's going on. Those are the battles. Those are the contentions. And you do not need to find the unfiltered truth, as it were. In fact, you cannot. It's almost certain that will not happen. So I don't know whether you want to talk about some myth-making and some true archives as opposed to other archives. I think the point to note is these are political interventions always. Right. The archive is a political space. It is created politically by the state most of the time, or by people in power, by men, and so on and so forth. You can go on and on. By majority groups, right? Which is why oppositional groups, women, lower caste people, marginalized people, border peoples, they've all had to ask different kinds of questions to elicit, to produce different archives, and through out of those, perhaps, different histories. Okay? The question about men's privilege and women's sexuality and desires, absolutely right. That is precisely the point. And this is what I was trying to get at when I said, Firaq Gorakhpuri says that Premchand could produce all kinds of women, but he could not produce that woman who is a sensual figure, sensually attractive. And it's quite interesting. One of the advantages and challenges of writing this in Hindi has been to think, how can I write sensuality in Hindi? And you know the answer, you cannot write it. You would have to produce 3 sentences. There is not a word for sensuality, right? Just as there is not a word in English for ghar samaj. In the Hindi, you'll say ghar samaj all of the time. And it has very specific meaning. You know, it captures a world in which ghar and samaj are completely interwoven. How do you translate that into English? Home society? Yeah, it has no meaning. And so you have to produce 3 sentences or 4 sentences and so forth. And so the point I'd make to you is this. And the question of what you called it protecting women's sexuality, guarding, right? Disciplining. is absolutely right. Desire might be a way of thinking of it. To not even recognize women's desire as desire is the basis of so much of this writing. And Rahul Sankrityayan, who is one of the most astute thinkers and wonderful scholar, is actually a very good example of this. See, Premchand would at some level have said, no, women are mothers. They do not have desire, as it were. Rahul had no such illusions. He believed that women, as much as men, must live the life of sensuality, of desire, fulfill themselves. Women, in his Gumakar Shastra, advocates this as a freedom for women as well as for men, in so many words. Nonetheless, he has a moment when the woman becomes a mother. And as soon as the woman becomes a mother, desire ends. And that is a marker of that kind of disciplining, which it seems to me has just underlies.
Well, I'm going to use my prerogative as chair to ask one final question, and then we can all go eat. And that is, why men at home and not men and women at home? Because in listening to your talk and the ensuing discussion, I think you've spent about equal time speaking about men and about women. So I'm just wondering why you have made that choice.
It's a good question, and I've spent time thinking whether I should say men and women at home. That's more clunky, first of all. It's not a very good way to say it. But I also do think that there is something unusual about focusing the performance and the rhetoric surrounding men's place in the home, men's own rhetoric around it. The women writing about it, the women observing it, commenting on it, is a very, very important part of what we have. We have quite a lot in the way of investigations of women and their place at home and their subordination and their marginalization and their the disciplining of desire. But I'm not sure that we have very much that focuses that performance and that place as it is being carved out of men in the Indian home during this time. And importantly to say, the Hindi version of this, which is to be published very soon, I actually say, Hindustani aadmi ghar mein, tab or ab, question mark. Right? So the Indian men at home then and now, right? So with a question mark. Okay? So.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks once again. And we have dinner in the lounge for everybody. And then we have a film screening at 7:30 just across the way in that building. Who'd like to be seeing communication studies? Yeah, 7:30. Thank you.